Today's daf, Be'ezus Hashem, is Masechta Zevachim Daf Ches, number 8. And we will begin from daf Zayin Amud Beis, 2 lines from the bottom. Just to recap, in the Mishnah, we discussed that the concept that Kol HaZvachim, any korban, Shnisbechu Shloi Lishman, that was shechted for not its sake. In other words, it was shechted for the wrong name. For example, it's a shlomim, and you shechted it for an oila. Kisherim, they're kasha. You don't have to throw out the animal. You can continue with the services of Kabbalah, Halacha, and Zrika, but the owner has to bring a new korban. Chutz, the exception is Mina Pesach, a korban Pesach, v'achatas. For example, a korban chatas, as the person is shechting it, he says, I'm going to shecht it for a korban oila. He did it on purpose, the kohen, whatever. So then, after you shecht it, you throw out the animal because the animal is pasul. That's different than any other korban. Any other korban, the animal is still kosher, but the owner has to bring a new animal. But the korban is still kosher. So now we continue with daf Zayin Amud Beis. On the bottom, 2 lines from the bottom. So the Gemara says chatas minolan. How do I know that a korban chatas? How do you know that a korban chatas b'di'eved? If you did it, you have to throw out the korban. It's a pasul korban. Now, the Torah is going to tell you, in order in the din in korbanos, is that the first time the Torah tells you have to do something, and then if the Torah repeats it, that means to tell you that if you don't do it, the korban is pasul. So we're going to have to see that it says it twice. Now, remember, there are 4 avodas, as you can see on the screen. You slaughter an animal, Kabbalah. It means catching the blood, halacha, bringing the blood towards the mizbeach, and zrika, and sprinkling it on the mizbeach. So these 4 are the services, the main services. So each one, it has to say that you have to do it lishma by a korban chatas, and it has to repeat it twice. So that's the key to this Gemara. So chatas minolan. How do I know that a chatas has to be written, has to be shechted lishma? The pasuk says v'shochat oisar lechatas. What's the pasuk? The pasuk says. "V'samach yodei aroisha chatas v'shochat oisa lechatas." Here you see it. You have to shecht it for a korban chatas. So So we see that if you don't shecht it the korban chatas, you did something wrong. Ashkechan shchita. I understand that shchita has to be done correct lishma kabbalah minolan. How do we know that catching the blood also has to be done l'shem chatas? The ksiv, because the pasuk says, we go to Daf Ches Amud Aleph, v'lo kachakayim midam chatas. You have to catch the blood from the blood of the chatas. Shetehei kabbalah l'shem chatas. Catching the blood has to be for the sake of the chatas. Says the Gemara, v'ashkechan shchita kabbalah. I understand shchita and kabbalah and halacha, by the way, because halacha and kabbalah are one and the same. So shchita kabbalah. So how do you know zrika minolan? How do you know zrika has to be done lishma? And says the Gemara, the Amakra, because the pasuk says v'chipa olav hakoyim mechatasoy. You have to do zrika, which is the kapara, from your chatas. So we see that chatas has to be lishma. Shetei kabbalah l'shem bailam, shem chatas. That the kapara has to be for the zrika has to be done l'shem chatas, for the sake of a chatas. Now, there's another way the 2 thoughts that you have to have when you shecht a korban is, one, you have to say, I'm shechting it for the right korban. If it's a korban chatas, you have to shecht it for the right chatas. And when you shecht it, you also have to say who you're shechting it for, who's the owner. You can't say, I'm shechting it for somebody else. So how do you know Ashkechan Shinu Kodesh? You tell me that over here it tells you have to shecht for a kachim. When you make a change in the korban, that's you have to have in mind which korban it is. That's what it says. You have to shecht it l'shem chatas and catch the blood l'shem chatas and sprinkle it l'shem chatas. Shinu ba'alam and. How do I know that you can't have the wrong owner in mind? How can I not say that I'm shechting it or I'm sprinkling it for the wrong owner? The pasuk says by zrika the chipa olav hakoyim mechatasoy. So the Torah tells you that when you sprinkle it, olav, it has to be for the owner. Olav v'lo al chaver. It's for the owner of the chatas, not on his friend. So, ashkechan, the mitzvah, I understand that it's a mitzvah to sprinkle it for the owner. La'akav minolan. How do I know that if you don't sprinkle it for the sake of the owner, the korban is pasul? And when the korban is pasul, means the kohen can't eat it. You have to throw it out, even after you sprinkle it. The extra vav in the word chatasoi indicates that it has to, it's almost as if it says, the Torah tells it twice. You have to sprinkle it for this owner. You have to sprinkle it for the owner. So since the Torah tells it to you twice, that if you even if you sprinkle it for somebody else's owner, the Torah is telling you that it's a non-kosher carbon. So if you look back at what you really have over here, you have two things over here. You have Shinu Kodesh, which is this, and you have Shinu Bailam. Here, we only found one pasuk that tells you that it's a mitzvah to do the shechita, to do the mitzvah by Shinu Kodesh, shechita Kabbalah Zrika. And Halakha and Kabbalah is one and the same. But we don't have la'akev. If we don't know b'di'evet if it's possible. By Zrika, we have twice. The pasuk says olav v'chatasai, so it's a mitzvah, and it's b'di'evet pasal. So how do you fill in the other parts? You have to fill in all the things. That's what the Gemara is going to do. So that's Gemara's question. Ashkacha mitzvah. We find that it's a mitzvah. B'shinu b'kodesh. We find mitzvah b'shinu kodesh. Uzrika, by Zrika, we find b'shinu ba'alim. When it comes to shinu ba'alim, bein la mitzvah, bein la akiv. That it's a mitzvah and la akiv. So b'chol avodas b'shinu kodesh, ra avodas b'shinu ba'alim, bein la mitzvah, bein la akiv, minolan. How do you know? How do you fill in the other parts of the grid over here, as you see on the screen? Vashina Kodesh, how do you know la'akev? Because the Torah only wrote it once, the mitzvah. And how do you know by Shini Balam, by the other avodas, by Shechita and Kabbalah, that there is a mitzvah, and it would be la'akev? So if we would skip down all the way to the bottom of the page, the Gemara is going to say, look, that there's going to be a hekesh to shlomim. That shlomim, we know, all the karchatas is a hekesh to shlomim, and shlomim, we know it has to be in the mitzvah, you have to have in mind. So also by chatas, you have to have a mitzvah. Le mitzvah. So then, when the Torah says it straight out by chatas, this would be la'akev. But that's how the Gemara would end off. How the Gemara is going to conclude. But before the Gemara gets to that conclusion, the Gemara tries other ways. Amar Rabbi Yoina said, "Asa chatas minazar." We learn it. The Torah repeated again by chatas nazar. A nazar brings a korban chatas. So the Torah tells you, he has to also shecht it. Here the Torah word v'asa. Anything that it's action that you do has to be done for the sake of a chatas. So then we know, so therefore, again, if the Torah repeated it by the korban chatas of a nazir, so then we'll say by the korban chatas, regular korban chatas, which is a korban chatas, and the korban chatas of a nazir, they both say that it has to be done l'shem chatas. So we see that the Torah repeated it twice. Ashkechan shinu kodesh. I understand the shinu of kodesh, shinu ba'alam and olam. How do you know you're not allowed to change the owner by the nazir? It says an extra vav, his chatas, the nazir's chatas. So the Torah repeated these ideas by a korban nazir. So it says it by a regular korban chatas. It says it by a korban chatas nazir. So now you have once for the mitzvah and once for la'akev, one for shinu kodesh and one for shinu ba'alam. Asks the Gemara, Maskef la Ravina, if you darshan chatasai, el miata oilas oilosai mai darshtabe. The Torah says that it has to be for his oila. Now, the nazir has to do his oila, and we know that if you're going to darshan by a regular oila, it says that it has to be done l'shem oila, and now you're going to have another extra pasuk by a nazir that it has to be done for his oila. So then it would be la'akev by a regular oila, and we know that by regular oila it's only a mitzvah, but it's not going to passel the korban b'di'evet, and that's the Gemara's question. So the Gemara asks Ravina, why you only ask oilasoi Ravina minchas minchasai nesach niskei mai dar shubuhu? It also says a nazar brings a mincha, his mincha. Nesach niskei, it says he should bring his nesachim. What are you going to darshan with that? So Rabbi Rina doesn't have a problem with that. That the Torah is telling you that the oil, the mincha, and the nesachim of the nazir do not have to be brought at the same time that he's bringing the korban. He actually can bring it by night or the next day, and it will still be called his mincha. So he has a drasha for minchasai and nisachai. But ela oilas oilasai mar darshube. What are you going to darshan with oilas oilasai? Are you going to tell me by every korban shinu balam, even by an oila shinu balam would be ma'akev because the Torah repeated it by a nazir? Visu, and what is your whole premise? Your whole premise is that the Chumash says like this. The Chumash says by a regular carbon chatas, you can see on the screen, all this, that it has to be done lechatas, chatas, chatas, chatas. And that by a Nazir, it says also it has to be done lechatas. So now you have it twice that it's written. So one will be a mitzvah and one will be la'akiv. So the question is, maybe the Torah had to write it by both, by a regular chatas and by a carbon nazir chatas, because I would not learn one for another. Chatas min nazir, we see gamre ma'adali, would I be able to learn one from another? Chatas chayla min chatas nazir, like gamre, I don't learn a chatas chayla from a chatas nazir. Shekain, a regular chatas nazir, yesh ima damam acher. There are other carbonas, so maybe the Torah was careful and said only by chatas nazir it has to be lishma, not by a regular chatas, because a chatas nazir is like a special kind of chatas. Or you can say the opposite. If the Torah wrote it only by a chatas chaylev, I would not learn from a chatas chaylev. Chatas nazir and chatas chaylev loy gamra shekain kares. The reason why a chatas chaylev that a person brings a carbon chatas because he, let's say, ate the non-kosher fats. The reason why that has to be done lishma, and if it's not done lishma, is because it's kares, because he did a big avera. A nazir didn't do such a big avera of kares. So therefore, the Torah had to write that even by a chatas nazir, it has to be lishma. So there is a reason why the Torah wrote lishma by chatas chaylev and also by chatas nazir, because I could not learn one from the other. Ella Amarava Rava said like this: Asim chatas mitzvah. So I'm going to learn the double language by chatas chaylev. It says it has to be shechted for a carbon chatas, and by chatas mitzvah it also says it has to be shechted for a carbon chatas. So memela, you'll have a second time la'akev. Why? The Torah says by mitzvah the ksiv also is a coin as chatas. She yekol asiyos l'shem chatas. That anything you do for a mitzvah has to be done for the sake of a chatas. You can't say it's an oila. How do you know that you can't make a change of the owner? Shinu balam by a chatas mitzvah. That he has to bring a kapara on this mitzvah, not on the mitzvah of his friend. So therefore, again, the Torah repeated these ideas that it has to be a shina kodesh. There can't be a shina kodesh, and it can't be a change of an owner. You can't have a change the owner by a mitzvah. And the Torah wrote that idea by a regular chatas. So the Torah wrote it twice. So we see that if you have the wrong intentions, it's a puzzle of carbon. Says the Gemara, that only assumes that you could learn that it's extra. But can I learn one from another? Can I learn a chatas mitzvah? I can't learn a chatas chaylev from a regular chatas mitzvah. Shekain, the reason is chatas mitzvah shikesh yesh ima damim acherim. It has other bloods. In other words, a chatas mitzvah is not brought as a lone carbon like a chatas nazir, which is the same idea. It's brought with other carbonates, like an asham. So therefore, the chatas mitzvah has this stringency that it has to be lishma. But I would think that a chatas chaylev does not have that stringency. And if the Torah just wrote it by chatas chaylev, chatas mitzvah, chatas chaylev, Gamra, I would not learn a chatas mitzvah from a chatas chaylev. Shekain kares, a chatas chaylev, you did a big avera. That's why it has to be lishma, because you get kares. But a chatas mitzvah didn't do the big avera of kares, and therefore maybe it doesn't have to be lishma. So the Torah did not have to write it by chatas mitzvah. The Torah had to write it by chatas mitzvah because I would not be able to learn it out from chatas chaylev. So then now the Gemara says, now you have three places. A regular chatas, it says it has to be lishma. It says by chatas nazir it has to be lishma. It says by chatas mitzvah it has to be lishma. So now the question is, so then one of them is extra. Let's learn one from two. Which one is extra? And let's let the Torah not write chatas chaylev has to be lishma. I'll learn it from the other two. By the chatas mitzvah and chatas nazir, they brought with other carbonos. Maybe the Torah only wanted those chatas to be lishma. How do you know a regular chatas has to be lishma? Let the Torah not write chatas nazir and learn it from chatas mitzvah and chatas chaylev. Malahalach shekain ein lehem sha'ela. You see, carbon chatas of a mitzvah, you have to bring that carbon chatas. A carbon chatas that you ate chaylev, you have to bring that carbon chatas because you did the avera. However, a carbon chatas nazir, if what happens, you figure out a way to shoyel on your nazir, like we did today, heter and nadarim, So therefore, you won't have to bring this chatas nazir. So it's not a guarantee that you're going to bring this chatas nazir just because you completed your naziris. Could be you'll be shoyl on the whole naziris, and the whole naziris never took place, never took effect in the first place. So the chatas nazir is a weaker type of carbon. So the Torah had to write by chatas nazir that it also has to be lishma. Like the Torah not write by chatas mitzvah and learn it from the other two, from chatas chelev and a chatas nazir. Mala halach shekain ein boim bedalus. Chatas mitzvah is a weaker type of carbon chatas because if the Torah tells you if you can't afford a chatas mitzvah, if you can't afford a chatas mitzvah, so then you have an option to bring a bird. So therefore it goes down a notch. So because of that, therefore, maybe a chatas mitzvah would not have that stringency that it has to be lishma. Therefore, the Torah had to write by each one of them it has to be lishma. But that's only the mitzvah. How do you know la'akev? That's the question. So we're back to square one. We have a source where it says that the mitzvah you have to do it, but how do you know b'di'evet if you did it and you didn't have lishma, the carbon is puzzle. So how do you fill in the rest of the things on this grid? Ela makra, and here's the bottom line. Zoi satayra la'oila mincha. The pasuk says, Zoi satayra la'oila mincha l'chatas la'ashem amlun zevach hashlomim. So you see, in one pasuk, it juxtaposes all the carbonas near each other. So hekisha akasal l'shlomim. Everything is compared to l'shlomim. Ma l'shlomim, bein shinikoyu, bein shinibayim, bein in l'shman, u'mitzvah. We know, l'chatchila, by a shlomim, has to be l'shma, and it has to be for the sake of the carbon and for the sake of the owner. So then I know for sure that even by chatas, it also has to be lechatchila. It has to be for the sake of the carbon, for the sake of the chatas, and for the sake of its rightful owner. Hilkach mitzvah v'shlam. So you learned the din of lishma from shlamim. V'hanach kroik la'akev. Then the Torah repeats it by a chatas, by each of the chatases. So to tell you that if you don't do it b'di'eved, by a carbon chatas, since the Torah repeated the same idea, it did not have to. If it repeated it by a carbon chatas, to tell you that b'di'eved, if you shech the carbon chatas shloi l'shma of the bailam or shloi l'shma of the carbon, you shech the chatas as saying it's an oila, the whole carbon is possible. I understand the chatas chelev that the Torah repeated it, but that's not the only chatas. We go to Amud Beis. Chatas the avodah zarah, the carbon chatas that you bring for a carbon avodah zarah. We know that there is a carbon chatas that you bring for a carbon avodah zarah. I didn't bring it up here, but when you do avodah zarah, the Torah says you bring a female goat. Or the Shmi is called bitis Musayim betumas migdash ukudashas v'loiksiv behu menalan. And says the Gemara, see, there's other averis that you can do that you have to bring a carbon chatas. For example, someone swears he's not going to eat and then eats. So you bring a carbon chayil of oirid, and that carbon oil of yared means that if you're rich, you can have a choice to bring a sheep or a goat. If you're middle class, you could bring two birds, chatas, and if you're poor, the Torah gives you a right to bring flour. But those are by shvua type of averas, or if you go into the base of Migdash B'tamei by accident. So here the Torah did not. So you're bringing chatas is over there. How do you know that b'di'eved, if you had a shinu kodesh and shinu bailam by those types of chatas, how do you know that b'di'eved the carbon is possible? Chatas avodah zarah asim chatas chelav. Then I learned chatas avodah zarah straight from chatas, a regular chatas shekain kares kamoisa, because a regular avodah zarah is brought on a sin that could potentially, if you did it on purpose, you'd get kares, like a chatas chelav. Hanach kula asam outside, and the others of Shmius Koil, Shmius Susayim, and Tumas Mikdash and Kestashev, I'm going to learn it from the Mahatzad, Mechatas Chai Chelev, Mechatas Nozir, Mechatas Mitzayra, as Rashi explains. So we find by other chatois, b'di'eved it's ma'akev. So also by the chatas oil of yared, it's also going to be ma'akev. And if you can ask a question, Nazoi, you'll always be able to prove it from another chatas which doesn't have that stringency. So we see that all chatois, and here's across the board, we have a source for all chatois. If you think the wrong owner, if you think the wrong carbon, right, shinu kodesh or shinu balam, then the carbon is possible b'di'eved. The Gemara continues. Tan Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, Pesach bizmanai lishmai kasha. Shaloi Lishmoi Pasal. Pesach, on Erev Pesach. I have a sheep that I'm bringing for a carbon Pesach. So if it's Erev Pesach and I think that it should be a carbon Pesach, of course, it's kosher. Shaloi Lishmoi, but if I think it should be a carbon Shlamim, Pasal, the carbon Pesach, if I say that it should be a Shlamim, selecting it, Erev Pesach for a Shlamim, it's Pasal. Let's say the rest of the year. Let's say I have a carbon Pesach on the 10th of Nisan. So it's not the time to bring the carbon Pesach. And I take this sheep that is set aside for a carbon Pesach, lishmoy, and I said I'm shechting it for a carbon Pesach, puzzle, then you have to throw it out. Shaloi lishmoy, but if you shecht it for a shlamim, kosher. How do you know a carbon Pesach, when it's not bismanoi, can be brought as a carbon shlamim? That means a carbon Pesach, it's a sheep, but it has a double name. Erev Pesach, it's a regular carbon Pesach. Before Pesach, or after Pesach, whatever it is, it's a shlamim. How do you know that idea? The Torah tells you, if it's a type of carbon that could only come from sheep, which is a carbon Pesach, it could be from a sheep or a goat. So then it should be Yehei Zevach Shlamim. You turn it into a shlamim. So therefore, obviously not Erev Pesach. Erev Pesach, it's a carbon Pesach, but any other time, a carbon Pesach is viewed as a shlamim. Says the Gemara, Ema shlamim. I would think that only if you shecht the carbon Pesach as a shlamim, it could be used. What happens if I shecht it as a carbon oila? Does it become puzzle? Ema shlamim in mida achrina loif. I shecht for a carbon. Let's say shecht a carbon pesach for the animal that's supposed to be used for a carbon pesach, and it's the 10th of Nisan. I'm shechting it for a carbon oila. How do you know that it's still kosher? Anytime you shecht it, whatever you're going to shecht this carbon pesach for, it's still going to be kosher. Anything you're going to think, anything you're going to say. Ema called a shachat lehavi kamaisa, but maybe if I shecht it for an oila, it should be like an oila. Okay, you tell me that if you shecht it for an oila, it's kosher. If you shecht it for a shlamim, then it's kosher. But how do I know that if I shecht it for an oila, it still reverts back to a shlamim? Maybe if I shecht it for an oila, it should become an oila. So the Gemara says, "You have a kasef l'shamim b'zevach." The Torah tells you that if you take this carbon pesach, you could shecht it for a shlamim, you could shecht it for an oila, kidder ka'amrit, then I would agree with you. Ashad the now that the pasuk says l'zevach l'shlamim, the chol d'shachad l'shlamim lehevi. The Torah is telling you, no matter what you're going to say about this carbon pesach, about this animal, which should be used as a carbon pesach, but you shechted it on the 10th of Nisan, so then it automatically reverts to a shlamim. Asks the Gemara, Ema, let us say, no, not true. Lezeva klal shlamim prat. Klal prat klal, aim beklal masha prat. Maybe I'm going to say it's a klal prat, that you could only shecht it for a carbon shlamim. And midach reini loy, but I cannot shecht it for an oila, because zevach is a klal. The Torah tells you can shecht this animal for any type of carbon. Then the Torah tells you only shecht it for a shlamim. So maybe the Torah is telling you that only if you shecht it for a shlamim, it's a kosher animal, it's a kosher carbon. But if you shecht it for an oila, it's not kosher. Answers the Gemara, Lashem hadav kala. Then the Torah tells you that the Torah repeats the word Lashem in that pasuk, right? In Tzayin Kabanoi, Zavach klal. Shlamim is prat. Lashem, it's for the Eibishter. Klal prat prat, Lashem. So it includes everything, even if you shecht it for an oila. Maskif lo Rav Yaakov ben Arpakoit. Rav Arpakoit said, if you're including everything, the first klal of Zavach says it has to be for an animal. Klali basra Lashem, called the Lashem, any type of carbon. It includes even for a chatas oif. And so if I'm going to shecht this carbon pesach for a chatas oif, it's also going to be kosher as a chatas bird. How do I know that the Korah only shechts it, that only if you shecht it for a shlamim or oila, only then it's a kosher thing. It's a kosher carbon. But if I shecht it for an oif, it's not kosher. Answers the Gemara, and here we'll end. This is how you would darshan it. Klal prat klal. You take the animal, right? Again, we have the sheep of the carbon pesach. It's 10th of Nisan. It's not the time to bring it. The Torah is telling you, if you shecht it as a shlamim, that's what you should do. That's fine. But if you shecht it as an oila, it becomes a shlamim. But if you shecht it as a chatas or oif, it would be non-kosher. Why? Because you darshan klal, prat klal, zevach shlomim lashem. It has to be similar to the example that the Torah gave. Ma prat, just like the example that the Torah gave before shudav shloi l'shmoi v'kosher. That if you do it shloi l'shmoi, it's kosher. Av kosher shloi l'shmoi kosher. A shlomim is a type of animal that if you shecht it shloi l'shmoi, it's kosher, like we saw in the Mishnah. Kol zvachim shnichter shloi l'shmoi. If you shecht the shlomim as an oil, it's kosher. So it's shlomim is a unique type of animal. So therefore, only a carbon pesach to be shechted like a shlomim. So an oil also. So therefore, it excludes chata sa'if. In chatas v'ashim loy. That Ishlamim is the example that the Torah used. So the carbon pesach could be shechted for something that could be like a carbon neder and a davar, but it can't be shechted saying that it's a chatas oif, because a chatas oif cannot be given as a donation or a neder. You can't vow to make a chatas. So therefore, by a carbon pesach, prior to Yontif, if you shecht it as an oil or shlomim, it's kosher and it's a shlomim. But if you shecht it as a chatas oif, it would not be kosher because it's not similar to the prat. So this ends Zevachim Daf Ches, and have a ksiva chsimit tov, everyone. Good bench.